Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 8th, 1866. Now picture this, listeners. You are wandering through the woods in very southern Canada, just a few miles north of the Vermont border. It's very beautiful, very green. It's, early summer. Not too far from Lake Champlain. And as you get near the outskirts of a very small town called Pigeon Hill, you notice something waving in the breeze. It's a flag. It is not the Canadian flag. Canada did not exist as a nation for another year or so. It is not the British flag. It is the Irish flag. The flag had been planted by a group of about 1,000 Fenians who had raided the village from across the Vermont border and planted it as a proclamation of Irish sovereignty. The larger context here are what's known as the Fenian raids, which are a series of skirmishes and raids and attempts by the Fenian Brotherhood to use the U.S. Civil War as context to destabilize the British Empire, fight for independence, maybe establish an Irish state in Canada. It's a little murky, a little harebrained, but also really fascinating. So here to discuss the Fenian Brotherhood and the moment when Irish independence, the U.S. Civil War, Canadian independence, British Empire, and lots more all mixed together in northern Vermont and southern Canada are, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
I guess, Niki, let's start with just what is the Fenian Brotherhood and who are these people roving northern Vermont?
So the Fenian Brotherhood is a group that's established in 1858 in the United States, which, is a tenuous moment in U.S. history. Things are a little unstable in the U.S. at that time. And it's based on the idea that Ireland should be independent, self-governing. It's an idea we've heard a lot over the past couple of centuries about Ireland, and they were using the U.S. as their base to advocate for this free Irish republic. And it's made up, by 1866 of people who had honed their military skills fighting in the U.S. Civil War.
Right. And these are Irish immigrants or first or second generation Irish, but still kind of very much aligned with the notion of a sovereign Irish state back in the homeland. Kellie?
Yeah, I feel, is it bad that I want to give these guys like an E for effort? Their tenacity at really, they don't have a lot. They're not incredibly heavily armed and have large amounts of people joining their forces, but they are relentless. And several times throughout, the mid 19th century, between 1866 and 1871, they are leading these raids or attacks on Canada, what becomes the Canadian government, to draw British forces to Canada and attempts to draw them away from Ireland, and then really try to use as much violence as they can to promote their own political agenda and their own sovereignty. And so, yeah. I mean, they fail, but at the same time, I don't know. I kind of always want to root for an underdog a little bit, and they're trying.
So we've got a picture of who the Fenians were. We talk about the Fenian raids, which happened over the course of 5 years starting in 1866. Kellie, paint a picture of what these raids are.
Yeah, so it's about 1,000, maybe 1,300 men who are basically plotting to seize and sabotage British military outposts. So they're going to these British forts and trying to thwart them, trying to overtake them, and really trying to do this in order, as we said before, to draw out the British, to bring the British to send in reinforcements so that they will have to sort of abandon other projects that they have going on. They are ambushed Fort Erie. This led to the Battle of Ridgeway, in which 13 Canadian militia were killed. 94 people were wounded. So, I mean, they're small skirmishes, but at the same time, they do have big consequences. People are dying. And, the Fenians captured people, then they released their prisoners, and then they basically vowed to strike again. And they keep doing these things pretty much until Andrew Johnson really starts to crack down on these raids to keep them from taking more lives.
Yeah, and from the description that Kellie gives, it's guerrilla warfare. I mean, it looks exactly like the guerrilla warfare that we think about from a much later era.
So let's take each of those elements one by one, and let's put aside for a moment the notion of a sovereign Irish state in southern Canada, which I think it was part of this. But there's also just this larger picture of the state of British Empire at the time, and it feels like there's two strands there. One is that there's just an effort here to destabilize the British Empire. So the British Empire is obviously involved in Canada, it's involved in Ireland, it's involved in lots of places, and the notion here is if we force the British Empire to fight on the front of southern Canada, it will make it less capable to oppress people back in Ireland. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a moment when the British Empire is getting close to its peak size, right? Where this idea that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and one of the upsides for people who are trying to fight off the empire at this moment is that it's got its fingers in a lot of different pots, and so it can be distracted. And you're sitting there in the United States, a country that successfully separated from the British Empire, and so there's an inspiration there as well.
Yeah.
But I also think that, when we look at this in the context of the Civil War, or really the close of the Civil War, these Fenian raids are a nuisance, particularly to Andrew Johnson and to other political or military officials who are trying to stop these raids from happening, that are wreaking havoc. And they're trying to still go about reconstructing this fragile union that has just experienced 5 years of war. So it's something that we don't really talk about in the history books because it's just this small sort of subset fringe group in a lot of ways. But I think it speaks to the larger ideas that people have about, sovereignty and nationality and what it means to sort of have control over your political destiny in a lot of ways. And this is what they're pushing for.
The Civil War is a really important context here, too, because one of the things that helped fuel the Fenians' idea that they could get away with this is that the U.S. wasn't particularly happy with Britain during the Civil War because Britain declared itself neutral and was actually in some ways aiding, providing some help to the Confederacy. And so the idea here that the Fenians were thinking was, well, here's a chance for the U.S. to get back at Britain by not interfering with these raids.
Yeah, that's actually one of the more fascinating, I think, entry points that this story provides is an understanding of British meddling in the U.S. Civil War and actually letting the Confederates, construct warships at British ports and doing maybe some sketchy funding. And, but yeah, I mean, that's a role, I think that's of the many, as you were saying, Kellie, there's so many stories of the Civil War that get glossed over when you think of it as just capital N North versus capital S South. And here's like this weird British involvement in the Fenians saying, well, maybe we can go after the British because they're on the side of the Confederacy and we can destabilize them and so forth. But also to that point, I also think the Civil War is a moment of instability and that can splinter off in all sorts of different directions. And we've talked a little bit about sort of on the Western frontier, how it kind of just created this moment of chaos and opportunity, and here we see it on the northern front, if you want to call Lake Champlain that, as well. Just this, it's like a moment where everything feels up for grabs, and so these roving bands of Fenians say, well, maybe we can cause some trouble here. Now, so this other strand. So we have, the British Empire, we have British meddling in the Civil War, and now we have this other column of establishing an Irish state in southern Canada. What's your read on this? How real of a notion was this? How harebrained was this scheme?
That's impossible. Well, I won't say it's impossible, but it's highly unlikely given the size of their group, which is about, 1,000 to 1,300 people that, tried to sabotage a U.S., Navy gunboat to slip across the Canadian border. They're trying to create this ambush of Canadian militia to overtake a space for themselves, but they're constantly thwarted. Andrew Johnson is sending in General Ulysses S. Grant to shut a lot of this down, and so they don't gain very much traction. But again, the attempt in and of itself, I think, is something worth pondering.
Yeah, look, they probably wasn't really any chance that this was going to happen, but they had reason to believe that maybe if they were able to put down a marker that the U.S. might back them. So the Secretary of State, William Seward, had, needed the Irish American vote, which had grown very large because of Irish immigration to the U.S. since the 1840s, that the U.S. would acknowledge accomplished facts, which is to say that if they managed to construct their Irish state here in North America, that the U.S. would recognize it. But what actually happened is that it's 1,000 people going up against Canada, which, as you noted, wasn't independent yet, but was about to become a country, the British Empire, and the U.S. state, because at the end of the day, the U.S. didn't actually want a free Irish republic sitting just north of their border either. And so, they're going up against three major powers, and it's 1,000 guys with guns.
They don't have a chance, and that
right.
They don't have a chance. But you know what? I mean, they've got heart. When I think about the Fenian soldier song, and it says, we are the Fenian Brotherhood, skilled in the arts of war, and we're going to fight for Ireland, the land we adore. Many battles we have won, along with the boys in blue, and we'll go and capture Canada, for we've nothing else to do.
For we've nothing else to do is such a good mantra. Right. It's what else are we going to do? But no, not to diminish the the actual attempt at establishing a free people here. So Andrew Johnson's sort of crackdown, or I don't even know if crackdown's the right word. There just seems to be a moment where Johnson just becomes kind of fed up with this situation. Yeah. He calls the Fenians evil disposed persons, and says that what they are doing are high misdemeanors forbidden by the laws. But he doesn't seem to be taking a big stand on Irish independence or even the British Empire. It does seem he's more just look, we got this war going on. We're trying to deal with our own business, and there's just this BS happening.
Bigger fish to fry.
Right, yeah.
And Johnson's presidency was kind of a mess. The last thing that he... Right.
Yes, that's important to keep in mind as well. One thing we should do as we wrap up here is, because I'm sure Canadian listeners are listening to this now and saying, wait a minute, this is a story about Canada. What about the Canadian perspective? And I actually do think it's really important to shift the lens a little and look at this from the Canadian perspective, because this strikes me as another in the long line of Americans assuming things about Canada and assuming that Canada is this blank slate neutral thing, and that they can just behave however. But I think a big element of this is the Fenians really misread how Canada would take this, right? And there was this assumption that we'll go in, we'll attach British forts. There's an Irish population in Canada that will support this. Well, as it happens, a lot of Irish immigrants to Canada were Protestants, not Catholics, so they weren't really on the side. And a lot of immigrants in Canada had come from the potato famine, 20 years earlier, and were probably just trying to live stable lives in a new country. And here come the Fenians saying, let's cause a ruckus. And so I think it is important to remember that Canada is a player in this, and the Canadian perspective is big, and it's not just this blank slate, blank slate to the north that we can muck with, which I will acknowledge is the way that a lot of Americans probably think of Canada.
That's true. I think that's true. I think it's also important to say that, the Fenians, they sort of they sort of bring down themselves a little bit. I mean, when you think of the fact they have all of this internal factions, they have a hard time with financial troubles. They've got like police informers. They've got opposition from the Catholic Church. They have a lot going against them just in and among themselves that keeps them from really sort of having or creating the foothold that they would like. But yeah, I think that's just, it's interesting that this even took place in the way that it did. It still kind of blows my mind that this was happening in this moment.
And then it happened for so long, given that they had zero allies, like zero allies. No one supported the Fenian raids, and yet they carried them out for several years. So we'll stand by Professor Jackson's E for effort.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Okay, that brings us to the end of the episode. Another reminder, we are opening up our big list of ideas document to anyone who becomes a Radiotopia member. So if you want to help support this show, become a Radiotopia member and then tell us that you've done that. We will add you to our document and you can see how this show gets made, the list of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands at this point, tidbits that we pour through to pick what we're going to discuss on each show. So thank you to everyone who's become a member, and thank you to all of you who are about to become members, and thank you to Nicole Hemmer.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks as always.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.